gardener came to repair the garden at the millionaire's house, and was shocked to see his photo in a black frame on the millionaire's table. Samuel tightened the laces on his worn work boots, the familiar feel grounding him as he prepared for the day ahead. The early morning sun painted the horizon in hues of amber and gold, promising a fair day. Samuel was a gardener by trade, but it was more than a job, it was a calling. He saw himself not just as a laborer, but as an artist working with nature as his canvas. His reputation preceded him. Among the affluent, he was sought after for his unparalleled skill in bringing life to barren gardens. Despite this, Samuel never let the grandeur of his clients' estates dazzle him. His pride lay not in their wealth but in his craft, the delicate pruning of a rose, the precise alignment of flower-beds, the whispering greens of a well-kept lawn. Life in Samuel's countryside cottage was simple but satisfying. The walls, adorned with ivy, spoke of years spent in quiet labor. His garden was his sanctuary, a symphony of colors and scents. In the evenings, he would sit on his creaky wooden chair, a cup of tea in hand, watching fireflies dance among the flowers. Samuel had worked for the wealthy for years, but when he received a call to repair the garden at a particularly grand estate, something about the assignment felt different. He couldn't quite place the feeling, a tinge of unease mixed with curiosity. Yet, with his toolbox and trowel packed, he set off, unaware that this visit would unravel the threads of his life. The wrought iron gates creaked open, revealing a driveway lined with ancient oaks whose branches formed a canopy overhead. Samuel's old pickup truck rumbled forward hesitantly, its faded green paint a stark contrast to the pristine surroundings. His eyes scanned the vast expanse of manicured lawns, interspersed with fountains and marble statues that seemed almost alive under the dappled sunlight. The mansion itself loomed ahead, a palace of white stone and towering pillars. It was the kind of place Samuel had only seen in magazines, a testament to wealth so immense it seemed otherworldly. The sheer scale of the property left him momentarily breathless. He pulled his truck to a stop near a staff entrance, a less intimidating doorway nestled at the back of the house, and stepped out. "Quite the place," he muttered, wiping his hands on his trousers as if to steady himself. The head groundskeeper, a man named Arthur, greeted him. "Mr. Samuel, I presume." Arthur's voice was clipped, professional, and he gestured toward the sprawling gardens beyond the mansion. "It's the east wing that needs your attention. The hedges are overgrown, and the flower beds have been neglected for years. A storm last week uprooted a few key plants too." Samuel nodded, grateful for the straightforward instructions. As he walked through the garden, his boots crunching softly against the gravel path, he couldn't help but marvel at the beauty around him. Yet something about the garden seemed off. It wasn't just the disrepair. There was a strange familiarity about the place, as though he had seen it before, but in a dream or a memory that refused to take full shape. He pushed the thought aside and focused on his work. The grandeur of the place was not his concern. Samuel had always believed that gardens, no matter how luxurious, were meant to be places of peace and life, and he was determined to bring that life back here. Still, as he worked, his eyes kept drifting toward the mansion, its tall windows like watchful eyes. There was something about this estate, something that seemed to pull at the edges of his memory. Samuel knelt by a bed of overgrown roses, their tangled stems strangling one another in desperate competition for sunlight. The delicate blooms had faded, their petals curling at the edges like forgotten whispers of beauty. He worked methodically, pruning with precision, but a persistent unease gnawed at him. As his hands moved, clipping and clearing, his mind wandered. There was something about the layout of this garden that felt strangely intimate. The curve of the path, the arrangement of the flower beds, even the placement of the ancient stone bench shaded by a towering willow tree. He paused, his brow furrowing as he stared at the bench. It was as though his fingers remembered the smoothness of that stone, though he was certain he'd never touched it. Shaking his head, Samuel dismissed the thought. The mind, he reasoned, played tricks when surrounded by unfamiliar grandeur. Yet, as he continued, the feeling deepened. He found himself humming a tune, a melody he hadn't thought of in years. But why now? Why here? He stopped, staring at the ground, trying to recall where the song had come from, but the answer eluded him. Hours passed, and the garden began to take shape under his careful hands. The chaos of overgrowth surrendered to order, and the flowers began to reclaim their vibrancy. Yet the disquiet in his chest persisted. Every corner of this garden seemed to whisper a story he couldn't quite hear. During a break, Samuel stood near the fountain at the center of the garden, gazing into the rippling water. The reflection staring back at him was his own, yet the face seemed unfamiliar. He suddenly felt small, as if the weight of the estate and its secrets bore down on him. "This place," he murmured aloud. "Why does it feel like I know it?" But there was no answer, only the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze. Samuel wiped his hands on a rag as he finished arranging a cluster of lavender near the garden's edge. A gentle breeze carried the calming aroma, but his unsettled thoughts dulled its effect. Arthur had mentioned additional tools were stored in the mansion's utility room. Deciding he might need them for the more delicate repairs ahead, Samuel dusted himself off and made his way to the rear entrance of the estate. The heavy wooden door groaned as it opened, revealing an interior that seemed plucked from a fairy tale. Polished marble floors gleamed under a chandelier dripping with crystals. Walls were lined with oil paintings in ornate frames, their subjects staring down with expressions of eternal judgment. The faint smell of fresh wax and aged wood filled the air. Samuel hesitated, suddenly feeling out of place, as though he were trespassing in a world that wasn't meant for him. He followed the directions Arthur had given, walking past cavernous rooms filled with velvet furniture and antique vases. Yet as he passed through the halls, something tugged at him. A sensation stronger than the déjà vu he'd felt in the garden. It was as if the house were alive, each creak of the floorboards a whisper calling his name. Turning a corner, Samuel stopped short. On a small, gilded table by the staircase, a photograph in a black frame caught his eye. Something about it seemed to demand his attention. He stepped closer, his pulse quickening. His breath caught in his throat. The photo showed a young man, dressed sharply in a tailored suit, his expression a mixture of confidence and ease. Samuel's hands trembled as he reached out and picked up the frame. The face staring back at him was unmistakable. It was his own. The man in the photograph was him, yet impossibly younger, perhaps by 20 or 30 years. Samuel stumbled back a step, the frame still clutched in his hands. His knees felt weak, and his vision blurred with disbelief. Memories he couldn't quite grasp swirled just out of reach, taunting him. "This can't be real," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The silence of the house seemed to deepen, as if it too waited for him to understand. Samuel sat on the edge of a silk-upholstered chair in one of the mansion's sitting rooms, the photograph still clutched in his hands. His heart pounded, each beat louder than the last, drowning out the serene hum of the house. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the image. It was undeniably him. His face, his posture, even the faint scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood accident. How is this possible?" he muttered, his voice trembling. He racked his brain for an explanation. Could this be some bizarre coincidence? A long-lost relative who bore an uncanny resemblance? Or was it something deeper, something more inexplicable? The idea of asking the staff crossed his mind, though a part of him hesitated. What would he even say? Would they think he was mad? Yet his need for answers outweighed his fear of sounding absurd. He rose to his feet, his movements shaky, and stepped back into the hallway. It wasn't long before he spotted one of the housekeepers, a petite woman in a neat black and white uniform, carrying a silver tray. Her steps were brisk, her head held high, but when she saw Samuel, she paused. "Excuse me," Samuel called out, forcing his voice to steady. "Could I ask you something?" The woman offered a polite smile, though her gaze flicked briefly to the photograph in his hand. "Of course, sir. How can I assist you?" Samuel hesitated, holding up the frame. This photo. Do you know who this is? The housekeeper's smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of something he couldn't quite place. Recognition? Worry. She glanced at the photo again and then at Samuel, her expression unreadable. Well, it's an old photograph. Been here for years, she said, her voice carefully neutral. The master of the house likes to keep it on display. Why? Samuel pressed. Who is he? Why does he look like me? The housekeeper's hands tightened on the tray, her knuckles whitening. I'm sorry, sir, but I'm afraid I don't know the details. Perhaps you should ask the master himself. Before Samuel could respond, she gave a quick nod and disappeared down the hall. Her evasiveness only deepened the knot in his stomach. Why had she looked so uneasy? And what did she mean by the photo being important to the master of the house? Samuel leaned against the wall, his thoughts a whirlwind. Answers felt both impossibly close and frustratingly far. For the first time in years, he felt truly untethered, as though the life he had built for himself was slipping through his fingers. The photograph weighed heavily in Samuel's hands as he wandered aimlessly through the mansion. His footsteps echoed in the grand hallways, each step amplifying the questions swirling in his mind. He had planned to return to the garden, but something about the house refused to let him leave. It was as though the walls themselves were urging him to stay. Passing a piano tucked into the corner of a room draped with heavy velvet curtains, Samuel paused. His eyes lingered on its glossy black surface, its lid propped open to reveal pristine ivory keys. Without thinking, he reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against the cool surface. A faint melody bloomed in his mind, unbidden, a song he had never learned yet somehow knew. The tune carried him back to a dimly lit room, laughter ringing out, the clink of champagne glasses. The vision faded as quickly as it had come, leaving Samuel breathless and disoriented. He stepped back, his hands trembling. What was happening to him? A faint aroma wafted through the air, a mix of lavender and sandalwood. It tugged at a thread deep within his memory. He turned instinctively, following the scent to a smaller parlor. Inside, the air was thick with nostalgia, though he couldn't explain why. A leather-bound book lay open on a table, its pages yellowed with age. The embossed initials on the cover caught his eye. Samuel traced the letters with a fingertip, his heart pounding. A sudden vivid flash consumed him. A man, himself, sitting in this very room, engrossed in the book. The fireplace crackled warmly in the background. But the scene shifted, darkening, the warmth replaced with anger. Another man stood across from him, shouting. His face shadowed but filled with malice. The memory wavered, fading into nothingness. Samuel stumbled back, clutching the edge of the table for support. His breath came in short gasps. He was sure of it now. This house, this garden, they were not new to him. They were fragments of a life he could not fully remember, a life far removed from the simple existence of a gardener. "Who am I?" he whispered, the words hanging heavy in the silence. The golden hour cast a warm glow over the mansion's east wing, but Samuel barely noticed as he stood in the center of the garden, his hands trembling. The scent of freshly turned soil mingled with the faint aroma of roses, but instead of grounding him, it sent his mind spiraling. Fragments of memories flooded his senses, sharper now, like a puzzle slowly coming together. He saw himself standing in a grand office, its walls lined with books, his hands gripping the edges of a mahogany desk. A younger version of himself was arguing with a man, tall, imposing, with piercing eyes that seemed to strip away all pretense. The words were muffled, but the tension was undeniable. Papers lay scattered on the desk, some bearing his signature. The memory faded, replaced by another, a celebration in the mansion's grand dining hall. Laughter echoed as glasses clinked. Samuel was there again, dressed in an impeccable suit, his smile wide but forced. He toasted with the same tall man, their camaraderie laced with something darker. Competition? Distrust. Samuel snapped back to the present, gripping the edge of the fountain for support. The memories left him winded, as though he had just run a great distance. His mind raced, connecting the fragments with the mansion around him. The curved stone bench by the willow tree, the faint melody on the piano, even the initials on the leather-bound book, all belonged to his past. But who was the other man? And why had he been in so many of these memories? Samuel's gaze drifted toward the mansion's upper windows. A shadow moved behind one of the curtains, a figure watching him. His pulse quickened. The realization struck like a bolt of lightning. The man in his memories was the master of the house. The millionaire who had called him here wasn't a stranger. He was someone from Samuel's past, someone who had been important, someone who had possibly betrayed him. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Samuel's unease deepened. The mansion, with its grandeur and secrets, now felt more like a labyrinth, a place where his forgotten life had been buried, waiting to be unearthed. The evening air had turned cool, but Samuel barely felt it as he stood in the doorway of the mansion, staring into the dimly lit interior. The realization of the millionaire's connection to his past had left him reeling. Questions flooded his mind, each one heavier than the last. Samuel's thoughts drifted back to the photograph. It wasn't just a decoration. Its placement on the gilded table wasn't random. Whoever lived here had deliberately chosen to keep it displayed, a quiet reminder of a past that Samuel had been forced to forget. He ventured deeper into the house, his boots echoing against the marble floor. The room seemed to close in around him, their grandeur now a shadowy maze. He found himself drawn toward the study, the door ajar and the faint glow of a desk lamp spilling into the hallway. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of aged wood and cigar smoke. Shelves lined the walls, crammed with books whose spines gleamed with gold lettering. At the center of the room sat a massive desk, its surface meticulously arranged. And there, sitting behind it, was the man. Samuel froze as their eyes met. The millionaire looked up from a document, his sharp features illuminated by the lamp's glow. His silver hair was impeccably styled, his suit tailored to perfection. But it was his eyes that struck Samuel most, a piercing blue that seemed to hold both recognition and hesitation. For a moment neither man spoke. The weight of unspoken words filled the air, thicker than the smoke curling from the ashtray on the desk. Finally, the millionaire leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "I wondered how long it would take for you to remember," he said. His voice calm but edged with something Samuel couldn't quite place. Samuel's breath caught. You know me." The man nodded slowly. "Do. I've always known. The question is, how much do you remember?" Samuel's grip tightened on the back of a chair. The flood of memories, the fragments of his past, they all pointed to this man. He was the key to everything. "Who are you?" Samuel asked, his voice low but steady. "And why do you have a picture of me in this house?" The man sighed, rising to his feet. "You already know the answer to that. You just haven't accepted it yet." As he stepped closer, the light revealed more of his face, and Samuel's fragmented memories clicked into place. This was not just any man. This was someone who had been a cornerstone of his life, a trusted partner, a confidant, and, ultimately, the person who had betrayed him. The room seemed to spin as Samuel staggered back. The millionaire reached out as if to steady him, but Samuel pulled away. You're the reason I lost everything," Samuel whispered, the words heavy with years of buried pain. "Aren't you?" The millionaire's silence was damning. His gaze fell to the floor, and for the first time he seemed vulnerable. The world around Samuel seemed to blur as his mind flooded with memories, each one more vivid and painful than the last. His breath hitched, and for a brief moment, he lost himself in the images that unraveled before him. He was no longer standing in the opulent mansion. He was back in his own world, a life of grandeur and success, before everything came crashing down. He saw himself in a grand ballroom, dressed in a tailored tuxedo, surrounded by people laughing and celebrating. The chandelier overhead sparkled as if it were made of diamonds, casting a soft, warm glow over the guests. Samuel moved through the crowd effortlessly, exchanging pleasantries with business associates, friends, and family. At his side was his wife, Margaret, her beauty radiant in an emerald gown. She smiled at him, and for a fleeting moment, he could feel the love they once shared, the life they built together. But even then, beneath the surface of wealth and success, there was a sense of unease, an undercurrent of tension Samuel hadn't fully recognized at the time. He could see it now, like a shadow lurking in the background. And there, standing near the fireplace, was the man, the millionaire. His eyes locked with Samuel's across the room, a silent understanding passing between them. Then the memory shifted. Samuel was back in a dimly lit office, the polished wood of the desk reflecting the soft glow of the desk lamp. His hands were shaking as he signed the final papers, his signature bold and confident. The millionaire stood at the opposite side, watching him with a gaze that was difficult to read. Samuel was certain that this was a pivotal moment in his life. He was making an important deal, one that would secure his future, or so he thought. In the following flashback, Samuel was no longer standing tall in his office but sitting in a sterile, cold room. The sound of a phone ringing echoed, but no one answered. Papers were scattered across the floor, and a single letter caught Samuel's eye. The words blurred at first, but he soon made them out. "Your investments have been moved. You've been cut out." The betrayal hit him like a punch to the gut. His pulse quickened as he remembered the shocked look on Margaret's face when she learned of the financial collapse. Their home, their life, everything they had built was slipping away. And in the midst of it all, the millionaire's face appeared again, this time not as a partner but as an adversary. His words dripping with cold indifference. "I didn't want this for you, Samuel," the millionaire had said. "But I had to protect my own interests." Samuel had trusted him, believed him to be a friend, a partner. Yet, in the end, the millionaire had betrayed him, stealing everything Samuel had worked for. Margaret left shortly after, unable to cope with the fall from grace. And Samuel, in his broken state, had slipped away into a quiet life, far removed from the man he once was. Why away from his former life and into the role of a gardener becomes clear. The memory of betrayal lingered like a bitter taste in Samuel's mouth. As more fragments of his past came rushing back, the weight of it all threatened to crush him. He clutched the edge of the millionaire's desk, his knuckles white, as he relived the devastating moments that had shattered his life. He saw himself standing on the steps of his once grand estate, a foreclosure notice nailed to the door. The mansion, which had once been filled with light and laughter, now loomed as a cold, empty shell. Boxes of his belongings sat scattered on the lawn, like pieces of his broken life laid bare for all to see. Samuel remembered the humiliation, the whispers of neighbors, the judgment in their eyes. But worse was the silence of those who had once been his friends, people who disappeared when his wealth vanished. Margaret had been the last to go. He remembered the tearful argument in their bedroom, her suitcase sitting open on the bed. "I can't do this anymore," she had said, her voice cracking. "I can't watch you destroy yourself over something you can't change." Her words cut deeper than he had expected. "I didn't destroy anything," he had shouted, his voice hoarse with desperation. "I was betrayed." But Margaret had only shaken her head, her expression filled with a sorrow Samuel couldn't bear to see. "Maybe. But what does that matter now? It's gone, Samuel. Everything is gone." And then, like everything else, she left. The memory blurred, and Samuel found himself walking aimlessly, his shoes scuffing against uneven pavement. Days turned into weeks, and the man who had once been powerful and influential became unrecognizable even to himself. He drifted through towns, his mind a fog of regret and anger. He remembered staring at his reflection in a shop window one day, startled by the hollow-eyed stranger staring back. That was the moment he had stopped looking back. The weight of his memories was too much to bear, so he let them go, piece by piece, until there was nothing left. Somewhere along the way, he stumbled into a small town where no one knew his name or his past. He had seen a sign advertising work as a gardener, A simple job, far removed from the life he had once led. Something about the dirt beneath his nails and the rhythm of planting and pruning felt grounding, almost healing. He had taken the job and started anew. The days turned into years, and Samuel rebuilt his life with his hands, finding solace in the gardens he tended. His past, once so vivid, became a distant echo, buried deep beneath layers of soil and time. The following morning, Samuel stood before the mansion, his hands clenched at his sides. He had made his decision. There was no more running from the truth. He had to face the man who had caused the destruction of his life, who had torn away everything he had loved. He knew the confrontation wouldn't be easy. In fact, he was unsure of what to expect. Anger surged through him, but so did a deep, gnawing emptiness, a hollow feeling that had once been filled with the excitement of revenge, but now left him questioning whether vengeance would ever truly heal the wounds. Samuel walked through the grand entrance, past the same polished floors and gilded walls, to the study. He found the millionaire seated at the desk, his usual calm demeanor betraying a flicker of unease as he looked up at Samuel. "I knew this day would come," the millionaire said quietly, his voice tinged with something Samuel couldn't quite place. "Did you?" Samuel replied, his voice low but steady. "Did you really know that I would eventually remember everything? That I would come back here to confront you?" The millionaire's gaze flickered to the window, then back to Samuel. "I never wanted you to suffer, Samuel," he said softly, as if the words were a confession he hadn't expected to say. "I didn't want it to end this way. But you—" "I trusted you," Samuel interrupted, his voice rising with the anger he had buried for years. "I believed in you, and you betrayed me. You took everything, my wealth, my family, my life, and you didn't just take it, no. You left me with nothing but shame and humiliation." The millionaire leaned back in his chair, his hands trembling slightly. "I never meant for it to go this far. I thought I was saving you, Samuel." "Saving me?" Samuel's laugh was bitter, edged with disbelief. "Saving me from what? You took it all, left me to die slowly in the ashes of my former life." "I had no choice," the millionaire murmured, his voice almost lost in the silence of the room. "The business was failing. We were all going to lose everything. I did what I had to do to protect myself. I thought it would be better if I took the reins. I didn't think you'd fall so far." Samuel stood frozen, unable to comprehend the words that spilled from the millionaire's mouth. "Better for you," Samuel repeated, his heart pounding. "You didn't care about what happened to me. You cared about yourself, just like always." There was a long pause. The millionaire looked away, a deep sorrow etched across his face. "I made a mistake. But there's something you don't know, Samuel. Something I should have told you a long time ago." Samuel's breath caught. What could you possibly say now to make this right? The millionaire rose slowly, crossing the room to a nearby cabinet. He retrieved an envelope, its edges yellowed with age. As he handed it to Samuel, their eyes met, and for the first time, Samuel saw the man before him as vulnerable, as lost as he had once been. "Before all of this happened," the millionaire began, his voice thick with regret, "you and I were like brothers. You were more than a partner to me. You were my closest friend. I didn't just destroy your life, Samuel. I destroyed mine too. I didn't know how to fix it. And when you disappeared, I lost myself as well." Samuel's hand trembled as he opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, handwritten, its ink faded but still legible. It was a letter from the millionaire, dated shortly after the collapse. He read the words, his heart racing. "I never wanted to betray you. I had no choice. Please forgive me, Samuel. If I could go back, I would. But all I can do now is hope that you find peace, even if I am the one who caused your destruction." The weight of the letter sank into Samuel's chest, and for a moment, he felt himself falter. The anger that had consumed him for years began to ebb away, replaced by a strange feeling of emptiness, of grief. He realized then that this was not just a confrontation, it was a reckoning for both of them. The letter trembled in Samuel's hands as he read it again. Each word seemed to etch itself into his mind, rekindling the fire of betrayal but also planting a seed of doubt. Was this confession genuine? Or was it another manipulation, a desperate attempt to evade justice? Samuel's eyes darted to the millionaire, who stood before him with a bowed head, his once imposing figure diminished by years of guilt. "You think this fixes anything?" Samuel's voice cracked, heavy with restrained fury. "A letter. A few words scribbled on a page. After everything you took from me, do you really think I can just forgive you?" The millionaire raised his gaze, his expression haunted. "No," he said quietly. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I need you to know, I never meant to destroy you, Samuel. I thought I was saving myself, but in the process I lost everything too." Samuel paced the room, his emotions swirling in a chaotic storm. The memories of his life before the betrayal, the love he had lost, the shame he had carried, crashed over him like waves. For years, he had clung to the anger, letting it define him. He had dreamed of this moment, of finally confronting the man who had ruined him. Yet now, standing in the face of his former partner's regret, he felt a hollow ache where his fury had once been. "If you truly regret it," Samuel said, his voice hardening, "then you'll make this right. You'll confess to what you did. You'll own up to your role in everything that happened to me." The millionaire nodded solemnly. "If that's what you want, I will. But it won't change the past, Samuel. It won't bring back what you've lost. And it won't give you the peace you're searching for." Samuel stopped pacing, his jaw tightening. The words hit harder than he wanted to admit. Would exposing the millionaire's betrayal really heal the wounds he had carried for so long? Or would it only deepen them, chaining him further to the life he had left behind? He turned to face the millionaire, the man who had once been his closest friend, and now stood as both his enemy and his reflection. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Samuel said, his voice trembling. "But I don't know if I can keep holding on to this anger either." The millionaire stepped closer, his expression softening. "I can't undo the past, but I want to help you rebuild. Whatever you need, money, connections, anything, I'll do it. It won't erase what I did, but maybe it can give you a chance to start over." Samuel's chest tightened. For years he had dreamed of revenge, but now, faced with the reality of it, he felt the weight of a different choice. A chance to let go, to move forward, and to reclaim his life on his own terms. Samuel stood in the garden, the morning light casting long shadows across the freshly pruned hedges. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of lavender and roses. It was the same garden he had worked on tirelessly just days ago, yet it felt different now, as though it had taken on a new life, much like him. The confrontation with the millionaire lingered in his mind, the weight of his decision pressing against his thoughts. For years, he had lived defined by what he had lost, by the betrayal that had shattered his world. But now, standing here in the midst of the garden he had rebuilt with his own hands, he realized something profound. He was no longer that man. The letter from the millionaire had stirred emotions Samuel hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Guilt, sadness, even pity. But most of all, it had given him clarity. He had spent so long fixated on revenge, yet when the opportunity finally came, he found it hollow. It wouldn't bring back his wife. It wouldn't restore his old life. And perhaps most importantly, it wouldn't erase the years he had spent as a gardener. A life that, while simple, had given him a kind of peace he hadn't known before. The millionaire had offered him restitution, money, connections, a chance to reclaim his former status. But Samuel had declined. It wasn't out of spite or pride, but because he realized he no longer needed it. The man he was now, the man he had become, didn't find value in wealth or power. His worth came from the quiet satisfaction of creation, of bringing life to the earth, of finding beauty in simplicity. Samuel looked down at his hands, calloused and weathered, yet strong. These hands had rebuilt more than gardens. They had rebuilt him. He had found purpose in the dirt, in the rhythm of planting and pruning, in the cycles of growth and renewal. For the first time in years, he felt light, unburdened by the weight of the past. He would continue his life as a gardener, not because he had no other choice, but because he chose it. It was a life of honesty and peace, a life he had created for himself. And perhaps, one day, he would forgive the man who had taken so much from him. But for now, forgiveness could wait. Samuel had a garden to tend, and with it, a future to grow. Samuel sat on the stone bench beneath the sprawling branches of the willow tree, the same one that had felt so hauntingly familiar when he first arrived. Now it felt comforting, a place of quiet reflection. A few yards away, the fountain gurgled softly, its rhythmic sound weaving into the peaceful morning. He had made his decision the previous night, after hours of staring at the letter and turning over the millionaire's words in his mind. Justice, he realized, didn't always come in the form of punishment. Sometimes it was about accountability and understanding, about ensuring the past wasn't repeated but not letting it dominate the future. Samuel had asked the millionaire for one thing: transparency. He wanted the truth of what happened between them made known, not out of spite, but to close the chapter with honesty. The millionaire had agreed, reluctantly but sincerely, and promised to take responsibility for his actions in their shared business ventures. For Samuel that was enough. As he stood to leave the bench, he caught sight of Arthur, the head groundskeeper, walking toward him. Arthur carried a small envelope, which he handed to Samuel with a quiet nod. "The master wanted me to give you this," he said before turning back to his duties. Samuel opened the envelope and found a note written in the millionaire's familiar, precise handwriting. Samuel, I will do as you ask. Thank you for giving me the chance to face what I've done. I can never undo the harm I caused, but I hope this will be a step toward repairing it. If you ever need anything at all, please don't hesitate to ask. Victor. Samuel folded the note and slipped it into his pocket. For the first time in years, he felt a genuine sense of closure. The weight he had carried, the anger that had driven him, began to dissolve, replaced by a quiet sense of relief. Back in his cottage, Samuel began to plan for the future. He thought of the small community he had become part of over the years, the children who marveled at his flower arrangements, the neighbors who came to him for advice on their own gardens. He realized he had built something here, a legacy that didn't rely on wealth or power but on connection and purpose. Perhaps it was time to expand that legacy. He imagined teaching others, passing on his knowledge of the earth and its rhythms. Or maybe he would finally open the small garden center he had dreamed of in passing, a place where people could learn to find the same solace he had discovered in the soil. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the garden in hues of gold and amber, Samuel felt a deep sense of peace. His past, though painful, no longer controlled him, and his future, though uncertain, was his to shape. The garden Samuel tended now was no longer part of the millionaire's mansion. It was his own, a modest patch of earth beside his cottage, a place where lavender danced in the breeze, marigolds stood proudly in their beds, and vines crept along a rustic wooden trellis. To Samuel, it was more than a garden. It was a living testament to his journey, a space he had built with his own hands, free of the shadows of the past. As he trimmed a cluster of roses, the sound of laughter drifted toward him from the edge of the property. He looked up to see the children from the village, their small hands clutching wildflowers they had picked along the way. They ran to him, giggling and eager to show him their finds. "Mr. Samuel," one of them called. "I found one like yours." She held up a perfect bloom, a daisy, its white petals catching the sunlight. Samuel smiled, kneeling to examine the flower. "You've got a good eye, Clara," he said warmly. "That's a fine daisy. Maybe you can help me plant some like it next time." Her face lit up, and she nodded enthusiastically. The other children chimed in, clamoring for their turn to help in the garden. Samuel chuckled, the sound coming easily, naturally. It had been a long time since he had felt this light, this free. Over time, Samuel had become something of a local legend, a humble man whose gardens bloomed with a kind of magic that seemed to reflect his spirit. Neighbors often visited, seeking advice, or simply to share a cup of tea in the shade of the willow tree. Samuel welcomed them all, finding joy in the connections he had once thought impossible to rebuild. Among the visitors was a woman named Ruth, a widow who lived nearby. She had taken to bringing Samuel homemade bread and tending to the garden with him on quiet afternoons. They often shared stories, hers of her late husband, his of the adventures he had as a gardener in his younger years. Over time, their friendship deepened into something more, a companionship that felt as natural and steady as the changing seasons. For Samuel, the garden had become a metaphor for his life. Just as the earth could heal and grow anew after being turned and broken, so too could he. His past, though scarred by betrayal and loss, had given him the strength to cultivate a new future, one rooted in love, connection, and purpose. Samuel sat beneath the willow tree, the sunlight filtering through its branches in soft, golden beams. In his hands, he held the letter Victor had written to him, the edges now worn from being opened and folded too many times. He hadn't read it in weeks, but today he felt the need to hold it one last time. The words on the page no longer stung. They were a reminder of a chapter that had finally closed, a testament to how far he had come. Samuel had decided not to see Victor again. The man's confession and efforts to take accountability were enough. Justice, Samuel realized, didn't always mean punishment. It often meant finding peace within yourself. And Samuel had found his. With a final glance at the letter, Samuel placed it in a small tin box along with a few other mementos of his past life. A faded photograph of Margaret, a cufflink from a long-forgotten suit, and a tiny pressed flower from his mother's garden. He dug a small hole near the willow tree and buried the box there, covering it with soil and patting it gently with his hands. It was a quiet goodbye, a gesture not of anger or regret, but of closure. He stood and stretched, his eyes scanning the garden that surrounded him. It was alive with color and fragrance, a symphony of growth and renewal. In the distance, he saw Ruth walking toward him with a basket of freshly baked rolls. Behind her, the children from the village ran through the field, their laughter ringing in the air. Samuel reached into his pocket and pulled out a small packet of seeds he had been saving. He knelt by the base of the willow tree, planting them carefully. The seeds were for sunflowers, bright, resilient, and always turning toward the light. As he finished, Ruth arrived, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Planting something new?" she asked with a warm smile. Samuel nodded, looking up at the sky. "It feels like the right time." The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the garden. Samuel stood with Ruth by his side, watching as the first stars began to appear. The past was behind him, buried like the tin box beneath the willow tree. Ahead was a future he had cultivated with care, one filled with love, purpose, and peace. For the first time in years, Samuel felt whole.